So reading from Exodus chapter 22, verse 16. If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If the father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins. You shall not permit a sorceress to live. Whoever lies with an animal shall be put to death. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord alone shall be devoted to destruction. You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. You shall not mistreat any widow or fatherless child. If you do mistreat them and they cry out to me, I will surely hear their cry, and my wrath will burn, and I will kill you with the sword, and your wives shall become widows, and your children fatherless. If you lend money to any of my people who is poor, you shall not be like a money lender to him, and you shall not exact interest from him. If you ever take your neighbor's cloak in pledge, you shall return it to him before the sun goes down, for that is his only covering, and it is his cloak for his body. In what else shall he sleep? And if he cries to me, I will hear, for I am compassionate. You shall not revile God, nor curse a ruler of your people. You shall not delay to offer from the fullness of your harvest and from the outflow of your presses. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. 7 days it shall be with its mother, and on the 8th day you shall give it to me. You shall be consecrated to me. Therefore you shall not eat any flesh that is torn by beasts in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs. You shall not spread a false report. You shall not join hands with a wicked man to be a malicious witness. You shall not fall in with the many to do evil, nor shall you bear witness in a lawsuit, siding with the many so as to pervert justice. Nor shall you be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. If you meet your enemy's ox or donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him. You shall not pervert the justice due to your poor in his lawsuit. Keep far from a false charge, and do not kill the innocent and righteous, for I will not acquit the wicked. And you shall take no bribe, for a bribe blinds the clear-sighted and subverts the cause of those who are in the right. You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt. So far the reading. Those children who are going to Grace for Christ can now go with their leaders and helpers. Well, let's come before God in prayer. Our Father in heaven, we pray that you will help us to understand your word, and that in this text you will reveal yourself to us. Lord, open our eyes to see what you intend in your word. Give us humility to sit under it and have it act on us, not to be over it where we judge it according to what we think it should say. Let it form us and shape us into Christ's image. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Well, there are times in life where you're reminded of where you came from, and this might happen when someone was, say, working at a supermarket, and they were the trolley boy, and they worked their way up into stacking shelves, and then eventually all the way up to being the boss. And a family member concerned that this might go to their heads reminds them, remember, once you were a trolley boy. You could get the same with refugees who come from overseas. They've come out of a country to make a new life for themselves. And after a generation has passed and they've integrated fully into society, they have children at university, they've got good jobs, they've got a house, and then a family member reminds them, remember, once you were refugees. And that comment does many things. It reminds you it helps you appreciate how good you've got it. It also helps you make sure that that new position doesn't get to your head. But it also means that you don't forget about those who are still where you used to be. Congregation, where have you come from? You are here today, but what were you? And I don't just mean what was your occupation or what was the country that you were living in, but what has God rescued you from? When God reminds you of what you once were, He is telling you, what is He telling you about how you should live today? In this passage, God is really teaching us how to have integrity in our relationships because of the way that God has related to us. He's taken us from what we once were, and He's brought us into His house, into His kingdom. And so, in this passage, we see a reason for integrity in relationships, and also then the life of integrity in relationships. And so those will be the two things we see in this passage today. So firstly, the reason for integrity in relationships. The reason is this: once you were sojourners. This Israel are reminded twice of this in these verses. So in chapter 22, verse 31, 22, verse 21, he says there, "You shall not wrong a sojourner or oppress him, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt." And then in 23, verse 9, he says, "You shall not oppress a sojourner. You know the heart of a sojourner, for you were sojourners in the land of Egypt." Now, children, a sojourner is someone who is a stranger in the land. They're a foreigner. They've come from somewhere else, and they don't really belong there. And so they don't have the full rights of that country. If I was to, say, travel to Japan, live there for a couple of years, I would be a sojourner in Japan. Israel were sojourners in Egypt. They didn't belong there. They went there to escape a famine, but Canaan wasn't their home. They were outsiders. And so when God tells them, once you were sojourners, it implies now you are not. You're not sojourners anymore. Now, this is a bit ironic, because when Israel lived in Egypt, they had homes. They were well established and settled. They had a street address, but now they are on the road. They're in transit between Egypt and Canaan. And so at the moment, they're just passing through Mount Sinai. They are, by definition, sojourners. How can God say to them, once you were sojourners, but now you are not, when they're on the road? Well, He can say this because Egypt was the house of slavery. That's where they didn't belong. They belonged with God. They belonged in God's house. And now that God has rescued them and brought them to Himself at Mount Sinai, they are with God. So even though they're sleeping in tents on the road, rather than living in their own homes, they are no longer sojourners. They're home because they're with God. That's where they belong. Now, God has saved them with a purpose. He's forming them into a holy nation so that He can dwell with them. Back in chapter 19, He said to them, "You shall be to me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation." Here He says it again in chapter 22, verse 31. He says, "You shall be consecrated to me." To be consecrated, that word consecrated is holy. You are to be holy to me, my holy people. Now, what does holiness mean? Holiness first begins with God. God is holy. It means He is exalted, glorious, transcendent. He is an object of awe and adoration, pure in character, pure in morals. He is entirely distinct from us. So when God then calls Israel to be his holy people, he is calling them to be what he is. They are to be righteous, pure, distinct from the world. It's a beautiful standard when God says to them, be holy as I am holy. God is saying to them, in my grace, in my compassion for you, I've called you out of Egypt. Now be distinct from where you came from and be distinct from where you're going. That's be distinct from Egypt, be distinct from Canaan. See, a believer living the way of the world around them is like a square peg in a round hole. It just doesn't fit. We are called to be distinct. Now, all of this applies to you in a far greater way than what it did to Israel. The Bible likes to often remind us of what we once were. Once you were lost. Once you were dead in your trespasses and sins. Once you were in darkness. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. Ephesians 2 verse 19 says that you are no longer strangers and aliens, but you are fellow citizens with the saints and members of the household of God. Congregation, once you were sojourners, but God saw you in your spiritual poverty, in your helplessness, and he took compassion on you. In his grace and his mercy, he brought you out of the kingdom of darkness and into his most marvelous light. Through Christ, he has reconciled you to himself so that you are no longer strangers or sojourners, but you are citizens of God's household. So you belong. Now, there is a sense of irony here, once again, because while we're citizens of God's household, we are in transit through this land, on our way to a heavenly land. We are pilgrims on this journey, sojourners on earth. We don't really belong here. And yet we're home because we are with God. And so as we pass through this life, our aim is not to put down roots on this earth, but to find our home with God in his kingdom. Anise and I had to think about this while we were in Australia. We had a home there, it felt like home, but when we came back to New Zealand, this felt like home, and you kind of think, where is home? But home is not where the heart is. Home is where God is. That is what we need. So whether you're as you pass through this life on your way to heaven, you are home when you belong with God. No longer strangers, but members of the household of God. And as people of God's household, saved by his grace, out of his compassion, you are then called to be holy as God is holy. His relationship to us forms the basis then of our relationship to others. Being part of God's house changes things. And so the second thing we see in this passage is the life of integrity in relationships. This passage is kind of giving a wide-angle lens, a snapshot of how we are to relate to others. The laws in here are all based on the Ten Commandments, but showing us that the Ten Commandments don't hover high above us, but they have real application in life. This will look different today than what it did back then. Remember from a couple of weeks ago, if you were here, what we're trying to do is not copy and paste these laws from then to today, but seeing how these laws reflect the character of God and then what principles there are that we can apply today. So we're going to briefly consider 6 different ways that a holy people relate to others. We're not going to look at every detail here, but try and build up a picture of how life in God's house affects our relationships. The first one here is that we are to act with purity. Chapter 22, verse 16 says, "If a man seduces a virgin who is not betrothed and lies with her, he shall give the bride price for her and make her his wife. If the father utterly refuses to give her to him, he shall pay money equal to the bride price for virgins." Now, as I was studying this passage, I went to one of my favourite commentators for help, and he said, "I'm not exactly sure why this law comes where it does." Well, great, thank you. But it doesn't matter. As hard as this passage is for us to understand, this is a wonderful law, and there's a few reasons why. Back then, if two young romantics slept together outside marriage, and then he didn't marry her, she would be disgraced for life. If later she tried to marry someone else, she could be killed. But if she didn't marry someone else, she would have no one to look after her. So it's kind of a lose-lose situation. You're either dead or you're hungry. And so this law protects that young woman who would otherwise be left vulnerable. God cares about her. He's compassionate for her, to young women. Now, there's an escape clause in here. The father didn't have to give the daughter away in marriage. If he really didn't like the guy, and that does happen, he could choose to care for her himself, and he would still receive a payment because that daughter will never marry again. So this is a compassionate law. It's also good because it teaches purity. There's a lesson to young men and to young women here. Young men, keep a lid on your desires. Act with purity in your relationships. Young women, don't let yourself be drawn in by young men because the cost is great, far too great. This law is radically different from the ways of the world where seducing others is seen as the goal. It's a call to holiness. But maybe one of the reasons this law is so wonderful is that it's also very realistic. The seventh commandment says that you shall not commit adultery. Young men and women must act in purity, but there are times when they don't. And that's what this commandment is addressing. When this doesn't happen, a young man must take responsibility for his actions. This will require wisdom as to exactly how that should look. But there's still a way to live with God and his people in the covenant community. There is forgiveness on offer. There is grace and compassion from the church towards this person, or towards this couple. So when a young couple have failed to stay pure but then confessed their sins and acted responsibly, they don't need to live in shame. As a church, we must remember, once we were sojourners, but God had compassion on us. So we can then have compassion on others. Second one is be devoted to God. This passage lists 3 offences which are worthy of the death penalty, and all of them actually are relating to worshipping other gods. So the nations in Canaan used sorcery to alter the future. They had these weird animal cults and fertility worship, and they sacrificed to other gods. So they gave the glory due to God to another god. God commands us, and Israel and us, to be distinct from Egypt and from Canaan, from the world around us, from where we came from. But all of these are a breaking of that first commandment, and in this situation, they all get the death penalty. Our most important relationship is our relationship with God. Holiness, holy relationships begin with Him. Imagine what a rejection it would be when God has rescued you out of darkness at the cost of His Son, and then you go and give the glory to someone else. And yet, before the end of this book, Israel will be worshipping a golden calf as Aaron says to the people, "These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you out of the land of Egypt." God's glory given to a piece of metal. There is a weightiness about God. Don't take Him lightly. And so for us, this means we should have a strong aversion to the gods of this world. Stay clear of TV shows talking about the dead. Be careful when attending ceremonies of other cultures. whether it's weddings or welcoming ceremonies or Matariki festivals. Ensure that you don't get drawn in to participating in worship to another god. You might have to sit some things out. One thing that's common today is talking about interfaith dialogue, the view that we should view all religions as equal. Again, giving glory to other gods. There is one God, and we are to worship him alone. Once you were an unbeliever, a sojourner, but God has rescued you in his grace and in his power, and so you belong to God's house. Ensure you don't give his glory to someone else. The third thing we want to see here is that we are to care for the poor and the lowly. We see this in verses 21 to 27. So when we see people who are outcasts in society, the poor, the struggling, we can easily look down on them. And it's all too easy to see their lives as being the product of their decisions. You know, if they hadn't done everything wrong, maybe their lives would be all right. God's command here is actually quite penetrating. It says, care for the sojourner because you were a sojourner. You know what it's like to be an outsider because once you were outside God's kingdom. Show compassion on them because God showed compassion on you. Is poverty their own fault? Maybe. Maybe not. It's not really the point here. The point is this. Once we were strangers and God cared for us. God is asking us then to look at those who are struggling and see in them our own depraved state before he saved us. And then have compassion on them as he did to us. You know the heart of a sojourner because you were there. This means that we should not ignore people in need. It doesn't mean we need to ignore the fact that there is a social welfare system today, but it may mean giving fruit and veggies to the poor. It may mean walking with someone to the WINS office to help them. It may mean sending money overseas to people who need it. It might mean not charging interest to someone who needs to borrow a little bit of money. Children, it might mean spending time with somebody who has no friends, caring for the lonely. Sometimes this sort of commandment can be hard for us to apply today, but it really begins with knowing how God was compassionate to us and then having this heart of compassion to others in all of life. Jesus actually showed us what compassion looks like for the outcasts of society, for the blind, the lame, the poor, the leprous. I was reading this week from Matthew 20, where two blind men call out to him. They say, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." And Jesus says, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they say, "Lord, we want to see." And Jesus has compassion on them, and he gives them his sight. That is the care that we're seeing here, caring for those in need. God cares about the lonely. He cared about you while you were lowly and lost. So care about others who need help. The fourth law, or the fourth thing we'll see here, is in verse 28, and that is that we should respect the government. Now, it would be an unusual person who has not had some strong words to say about the government at some point in their lives, probably at least once. We find them easy to sling dirt at, and we easily forget that God has placed them there for our good. God says here, do not curse a ruler of your people. God has placed them there to rule over you. Now, one could argue that times were different back in Israel, and they were. The national community was also their church community. It's what we would call a theocratic government, church and state combined. We have a different setup. We have the church and we have state, and they're separate things. But this doesn't absolve the command. It actually extends it. And so God places elders over us to rule in the church. Don't badmouth the elders who are placed there to rule over you. They are there for your good, to care for you and love you. And at the same time, God places civil rulers over you in the government. Respect them, not blindly, not pretending they're perfect when they're not, but not bad-mouthing them either. Do not curse a ruler of your people. Be subject to the governing authorities because they are instituted by God. Paul tells us about this in Romans 13, and it's good for us to remember that when Paul wrote that, Nero was in government, known for his tyranny and his persecution of Christians, and yet Paul commands the church to respect him. Do not curse a ruler of your people. The fifth thing here is that we are to uphold truth and justice, and we see this in chapter 23. See, another way that God is holy is that he is a God of truth and of justice. And so, as people saved by him, we also are to be a people of truth and justice, to care for what is right in our speech and in court. Verse 1 there says, "You shall not spread a false report." Don't fabricate a story to get someone charged of a crime. Don't enlarge the truth to make things sound worse than what they actually are. Children, don't make up a story about your siblings to get them in trouble. Verse 1 also says that we are to not side with the wicked. Verse 2 says we are to not side with the crowd. That is, don't give in to peer pressure. If you know someone is innocent, stand up for them, even if no one else is. Don't give in to peer pressure. And verse 3, maybe the most interesting one, says that we are to not, you shall not be partial to a poor man in his lawsuit. In other words, feeling sorry for someone is not a reason to let them off the hook. Treat crime as a crime, regardless of somebody's wealth. Ensure that justice is according to the crime, whether someone is a celebrity or the poorest of the poor. Justice is justice. Why? Because God deals with each and every sin. God does not adjust his justice based on someone's ability to pay. When you were unable to pay, he didn't actually let you off the hook. He put his justice on Christ so that you could be reconciled to him. God is always just, so we are to deal justly with others. Lastly, we want to see here that you are to love your enemy. In verses 4 and 5 we read, "If you meet your enemy's ox or his donkey going astray, you shall bring it back to him. If you see the donkey of one who hates you lying down under its burden, you shall refrain from leaving him with it. You shall rescue it with him." Congregation, when was the last time that you went out of your way to help someone who you really didn't like or who really didn't like you? Yesterday's donkey is today's trailer. And if you saw someone who you found really annoying, or maybe just a bit weird, stuck on the side of the road with their trailer lying down under its burden because they stacked it too high, would you go out of your way to help them? Cancel appointments for the day, change all of your plans so that you can help this person in their need. You see, Christians are called to a radical standard, to love your enemies, inconvenience yourself for people who don't like you. Jesus reiterated this as he lived. He said that the general attitude of the first century was to love your neighbor and hate your enemy. And that's easy. It's easy to love people who love you. But Jesus said, love your enemy and pray for those who persecute you so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. Don't be like the world. Love your enemies. Pray for your enemies. Pray for people you don't like, and pray for people who don't like you. Pray that they will know the love of God, the compassion that you have received. Why? Because while we were enemies of God, lying down under the burden of sin and could do nothing to help ourselves, Christ died for us. So love others as God has loved you. Life on the inside is different to life on the outside. In God's house, we are called to a radical standard of holiness, to be distinct from where we came from, to be distinct from the world around us. And this new status affects all of relationships. Relationships with people of the opposite sex, or within the church, with God, with the poor, with the government, with the enemy. It impacts every sphere of life: the bedroom, the courtroom, the church, the neighborhood, the road. The 10 Commandments matter in all of life. We are called to holiness by having integrity in relationships, radically distinct, because God has loved us in that radical way when we were lost. The motivation is the compassion of God, and the way to holiness is through the work of Jesus Christ. We're about to take part in the Lord's Supper. As you do so, remember what you once were. Once you were strangers, but now you are members of God's house. Once you were enemies of God, but He has reconciled you so that now you are God's sons and daughters. Once you were lost, but now you are found. Once you were not a people, but now you are God's people. That is a truth to comfort our souls, and it is a truth to change our lives and our relationships. Amen.